The wind howled across the Arizona desert like a wounded animal, carrying with it the scent of rain and the promise of trouble. Sarah Running Bear pulled her worn leather jacket tighter around her shoulders as she watched the dark clouds gather over the sacred mountains her people had called home for generations. At 28, she had seen many storms, but something about this one felt different. It felt like an ending. Her grandmother, Elena, sat beside her on the wooden porch of their small house on the reservation, her weathered hands working automatically on a piece of traditional beadwork. The old woman's eyes, clouded with cataracts but still sharp with wisdom, never left the approaching storm. "The horses are restless," Elena said in their native language, her voice barely above a whisper. "They know what's coming." Sarah nodded, understanding that her grandmother wasn't just talking about the weather. For months, the Apache tribe had been struggling with a crisis that threatened to destroy everything they held sacred. The reservation's finances were in ruins. Medical bills from the recent epidemic that had swept through their community had drained their emergency funds. The tribal school needed repairs that would cost more money than they had seen in years. Worst of all, the bank was threatening to foreclose on the last piece of ancestral land that housed their sacred horse herd. The horses weren't just animals to the Apache people. They were living symbols of freedom, strength, and their connection to the spirit world. For over 200 years, these horses had been passed down from generation to generation, their bloodlines carefully preserved. Each horse carried the stories of their ancestors, the memories of battles fought and won, of long journeys across the desert, of times when the Apache people rode free across the vast American landscape. Sarah's great-great-grandfather had been a renowned horse warrior, known throughout the Southwest for his skill in training and riding the magnificent animals. The story said he could communicate with horses through touch alone, that he understood their spirits in a way that seemed almost magical. That gift had been passed down through the generations, and now Sarah found herself as one of the last keepers of that ancient knowledge. The storm clouds grew darker as Sarah thought about the meeting scheduled for tomorrow. Representatives from the Bureau of Indian Affairs were coming to discuss the tribe's financial situation. Everyone knew what that meant. They would talk about practical solutions and modern alternatives. They would suggest selling the horses to pay off the debts, breaking apart the herd that had been together for generations. Sarah's phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out to see a text message from her cousin Marcus, who worked as a paramedic in Phoenix. "Heard about tomorrow's meeting. Wish I could be there. Fight for them, Sarah. Don't let them take our heritage." She showed the message to her grandmother, who squinted at the phone screen before nodding slowly. "Marcus has a good heart, but he lives in the white man's world now. He sends money when he can, but money isn't everything." "Money is what we need right now, grandmother," Sarah replied, unable to keep the frustration out of her voice. "The horses eat every day. The veterinary bills are enormous. The younger families are moving away because there's no work here. How long can we keep holding on to the past when the present is falling apart?" Elena set down her beadwork and reached for Sarah's hand. Her grip was surprisingly strong for someone her age. "Child, you speak of the past and present as if they are enemies. But our ancestors understood that time moves in circles, not straight lines. What appears to be an ending might be a new beginning." Before Sarah could respond, she heard the sound of an engine approaching. A large, expensive-looking truck was making its way down the dusty road that led to their small cluster of homes. This was unusual. Visitors from outside the reservation were rare, especially ones driving vehicles that probably cost more than most families here made in several years. The truck pulled to a stop in front of their house, and a tall, weathered man stepped out. He was clearly not from around here. His clothes were expensive but practical, the kind worn by someone who worked outdoors but had plenty of money. His boots were custom-made leather, and his hat was a genuine Stetson that had seen real use. But it was his eyes that caught Sarah's attention. They were the eyes of someone who had spent his life around animals, someone who understood them. "Excuse me," the stranger said, removing his hat as he approached the porch. His voice carried a slight Texas accent. "I'm looking for the tribal council. I was told I might find someone here who could help me." Elena studied the man carefully before speaking. "I am Elena Running Bear, elder of this community. This is my granddaughter, Sarah. She speaks for the horses. What brings you to our land? The man's expression changed slightly when Elena mentioned the horses. My name is James McAllister. I own a ranch about 100 miles north of here. I've heard about your financial situation, and I have a proposition that might interest you. Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the approaching storm. What kind of proposition? McAllister glanced at the dark clouds overhead. It's quite a story, and this storm looks like it's going to be a big one. Mind if I come inside? What I have to say might take a while. Against her better judgment, Sarah found herself nodding. There was something about this man that didn't feel threatening, despite the obvious wealth that marked him as an outsider. Elena rose slowly from her chair, gesturing for McAllister to follow them inside. Their small living room was decorated with traditional Apache artwork and family photographs spanning several generations. McAllister's eyes moved across the walls, taking in the images of proud warriors on horseback, family gatherings, and ceremonial events. He paused at a large photograph of Sarah's great-great-grandfather, mounted on a beautiful painted horse. That's Running Thunder, Sarah said, following his gaze. He was my great-great-grandfather. The stories say he never lost a horse to sickness or injury. He could heal them with his hands. McAllister nodded slowly. I've heard stories about men like that. My own grandfather claimed to have similar gifts, though I never saw it myself. He turned to face both women. That's actually part of why I'm here. Elena settled into her favorite chair and gestured for the others to sit. Speak your truth, James McAllister. The storm gives us time to listen. McAllister sat down, his hat in his hands. 3 weeks ago, I lost almost my entire herd to a disease that the veterinarians can't identify or treat. 40 years of breeding, over 800 horses, gone in a matter of days. The only ones that survived were a small group that had been separated from the main herd for breeding purposes. 18 horses out of 800. Sarah felt a pang of sympathy despite herself. Losing horses was something she understood, even if she couldn't imagine losing so many at once. I'm sorry for your loss, she said quietly. But I don't understand what that has to do with us. McAllister leaned forward. I've spent the last 3 weeks talking to veterinarians, animal behaviorists, and Native American historians. Every trail led me to the same conclusion: there are healing practices, ancient knowledge about horses, that modern medicine can't replicate. Knowledge that your people have preserved. Elena's expression grew thoughtful. You seek our healing ways for your animals. More than that, McAllister said. I've done my research on your situation here. I know about the financial problems, the threatened foreclosure, the pressure to sell your herd. I have a proposition that might solve both our problems. Sarah felt her heart rate increase. What kind of proposition? McAllister reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded document. I want to bring my 18 surviving horses here, to your land, to be healed by your traditional methods. In exchange, I'm prepared to pay enough money to solve your financial crisis completely. The room fell silent except for the sound of wind beginning to rattle the windows. Sarah stared at the document in McAllister's hands, afraid to hope and afraid not to. How much money are we talking about? She asked carefully. McAllister met her eyes directly. $1 million. Paid in full, immediately, if you can heal my horses and teach me your methods. Sarah felt like the wind had been knocked out of her. $1 million would not only save their land and their herd, but would provide enough resources to rebuild their community, repair the school, and create opportunities for the younger generation to stay instead of moving away to find work. But Elena's expression remained cautious. There is more to this offer than money, I think. McAllister nodded. There is. I've heard about your herd, bloodlines that go back centuries, horses that have never been corrupted by modern breeding practices. If your healing methods work on my horses, I want to establish a partnership. A breeding program that would combine your traditional knowledge with my resources. You want to buy our horses, Sarah said flatly. No, McAllister said firmly. I want to work with you. Your people would maintain ownership and control of your herd. I would provide funding for a proper facility, veterinary care, and breeding programs that could preserve your bloodlines while generating income for your community. It would be a true partnership. Elena stood up slowly and walked to the window, watching the storm clouds roll across the sky. My granddaughter, come here. Sarah joined her grandmother at the window. In the distance, she could see their horses huddled together in the field, instinctively seeking shelter from the approaching storm. Even from this distance, she could make out the distinctive markings that told the story of each animal's heritage. What do you think, child? Elena asked quietly. Sarah's mind was racing. The offer seemed too good to be true, but McAllister appeared genuine. The money would solve their immediate problems, but at what cost? Could they trust an outsider with their most sacred traditions? I think, Sarah said slowly, that we need to hear the rest of this story before we can decide anything. Elena nodded and returned to her chair. James McAllister, you have not told us the whole truth. There is something else that brings you here, something more than sick horses and traditional healing. McAllister was quiet for a long moment, as if weighing how much to reveal. Finally, he sighed deeply. You're right. There is more to the story. He set his hat on the coffee table and ran his hands through his graying hair. The disease that killed my horses, the veterinarians think it might be something new, something that could spread to other herds across the country. If they can't find a cure, it could devastate the horse industry. Sarah felt a chill of understanding. You think our traditional methods might be the key to stopping this disease? I do. And I'm not the only one who thinks so. The Department of Agriculture is watching what happened to my herd very carefully. If this disease spreads, they'll start implementing quarantine measures that could shut down horse operations across the Southwest. Elena's eyes sharpened. Including ours. Including yours. Unless we can find a cure first. The full weight of the situation began to settle on Sarah. They weren't just talking about money anymore, or even about preserving their own herd. They were talking about potentially saving horses across the country, using knowledge that had been passed down through generations of her people. There's something else, McAllister continued. I've been in contact with several other ranchers who are willing to contribute to this project. If we can prove that traditional healing methods work, we could establish a research center here that would bring jobs and resources to your community for decades to come. The storm finally arrived with a crash of thunder that shook the small house. Rain began to pound against the windows, and Sarah could hear the horses neighing in the distance, calling to each other through the wind and rain. Elena closed her eyes and seemed to be listening to something beyond the storm. When she opened them again, she looked directly at McAllister. James McAllister, you offer us great wealth and promise us great purpose. But wealth can be lost, and promises can be broken. What guarantee do we have that you will honor your word? McAllister reached for his wallet and pulled out a business card and a photograph. The photograph showed a young Native American woman in a hospital bed, smiling despite her obvious illness. This is my daughter, Maria. Her mother was Navajo. Maria was diagnosed with cancer 2 years ago, and the doctors said she had 6 months to live. But her mother's people knew traditional healing methods that the doctors had never heard of. They combined those methods with modern medicine, and today Maria is cancer-free. He paused, his voice thick with emotion. I learned something during that time. I learned that there are kinds of knowledge that can't be found in textbooks or laboratories. Knowledge that has been preserved by people like you, against all odds, through centuries of persecution and hardship. Sarah found herself studying the photograph. The young woman in the picture had her father's eyes but features that spoke of Native heritage. She looked strong and determined, despite her circumstances. Maria is studying veterinary medicine now, McAllister continued. She wants to learn how to combine traditional healing methods with modern veterinary science. If this partnership works, she would be part of the team. Elena nodded slowly. You seek to honor your daughter's heritage by preserving ours. I seek to honor all our children by giving them a future that includes the wisdom of the past. Sarah looked from McAllister to her grandmother, then back to the photograph in her hands. The storm raged outside, but inside the small room, she felt a strange sense of calm settling over her. "If we agreed to consider your proposition," she said carefully, "what would be the next step?" McAllister pulled out a cell phone and scrolled through several photographs. "I'd like you to see my horses first. They're in a temporary facility about 20 miles from here. Tomorrow, if the storm passes, I could bring you there. You could evaluate their condition and decide whether your methods might help them." Elena stood up again, this time moving toward an old wooden chest in the corner of the room. She opened it carefully and withdrew a bundle wrapped in soft leather. Inside was a collection of herbs, roots, and other traditional healing materials that had been passed down through generations. "These remedies have been in our family for over a century," she said, showing the contents to McAllister. "My grandmother taught me to prepare them when I was Sarah's age. But Sarah has gifts that go beyond what can be learned from books or even from elders like me." She turned to her granddaughter. "Show him, child." Sarah hesitated. She had always been reluctant to demonstrate her abilities to outsiders, knowing how easily they could be misunderstood or dismissed. But something about McAllister's story, his obvious love for his daughter and his respect for traditional ways, made her feel that he might understand. She walked to the window and placed her hand flat against the glass. In the distance, despite the storm, the horses had begun to move. Slowly, one by one, they emerged from their shelter and began walking toward the house. McAllister watched in amazement as the entire herd approached through the rain and wind, their movements synchronized as if responding to some invisible signal. They arranged themselves in a circle around the small house, their heads turned toward the window where Sarah stood. "How did you do that?" he whispered. Sarah didn't answer immediately. She could feel the connection flowing between herself and the animals, a wordless communication that had always been as natural to her as breathing. Finally, she stepped back from the window. "I don't know how to explain it," she said simply. "It's something I've been able to do since I was a child. My grandmother says it's a gift from the spirits, but I think it's simpler than that. I think it's just about listening." McAllister stood and walked to the window himself. The horses remained in their circle, calm despite the storm raging around them. "Could you teach someone else to do that?" "I could try," Sarah said. "But gifts like this can't be forced. They have to grow naturally, through patience and respect and understanding." Elena wrapped the healing bundle carefully and returned it to the chest. "James McAllister, you have given us much to think about. This storm will pass by morning, and, when it does, we will have our answer for you." McAllister nodded and picked up his hat. "I understand. This is not a decision to be made lightly." He paused at the door. "But I want you to know, regardless of what you decide, I respect what you've preserved here. The world needs more places like this, more people like you." After he left, Sarah and Elena sat in silence, listening to the storm gradually weaken. The horses had returned to their shelter, but Sarah could still feel their presence in her mind, their trust and their dependence on her decisions. "What do you think, grandmother?" she asked finally. Elena was quiet for a long time. "I think," she said eventually, "that sometimes the spirits send us exactly what we need, even when it comes in a form we don't expect." Sarah nodded, but her heart was heavy with the weight of responsibility. Tomorrow, she would have to make a choice that would affect not just her own life, but the lives of everyone in her community. She would have to decide whether to trust a stranger with their most sacred traditions, whether to risk everything they had preserved for the chance at something greater. Outside, the storm began to fade, but Sarah knew that the railstorm was just beginning. The morning sun painted the desert in shades of gold and red as Sarah made her way to the makeshift corral where McAllister's 18 surviving horses were being kept. Elena walked beside her, carrying the leather bundle of traditional healing medicines, while McAllister followed a respectful distance behind, his daughter Maria at his side. Maria McAllister was 23 years old, with long dark hair braided in the traditional style her Navajo mother had taught her. Despite her father's obvious wealth, she wore simple jeans and boots, and carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had faced death and survived. Sarah found herself liking the young woman immediately. My mother always said that the first step in healing any animal is to listen to what it's trying to tell you, Maria said as they approached the temporary facility. She taught me some basic techniques when I was younger, but nothing like what you can do. Sarah nodded, but her attention was already shifting to the horses ahead. Even from a distance, she could sense their distress. These animals had survived something terrible, and the trauma was written in every line of their bodies. The temporary facility was well constructed but clearly hastily built. McAllister had spared no expense in creating a safe environment for his surviving horses, but Sarah could see that the animals were not thriving. They stood apart from each other, their usual social bonds disrupted by their shared trauma. As they approached the fence, one of the horses, a beautiful bay mare with distinctive white markings, lifted her head and stared directly at Sarah. The connection was immediate and intense. Sarah could feel the mare's fear, her confusion, and, underneath it all, a deep sadness for the lost members of her herd. "That's Star Dancer," McAllister said quietly. "She was the leader of my breeding program. 16 years old, perfect bloodlines, never sick a day in her life until this happened." Sarah stepped closer to the fence, extending her hand slowly. Star Dancer approached cautiously, her nostrils flaring as she caught Sarah's scent. When their skin made contact, Sarah felt a rush of images and emotions that almost overwhelmed her. She saw the disease as Star Dancer had experienced it, a slow poisoning that had affected not just the horses' bodies but their spirits. She felt the mare's horror as her companions began to sicken and die around her, the helplessness of being unable to save them or even understand what was happening. But underneath the trauma, Sarah sensed something else. Star Dancer wasn't just sick in body, she was sick in spirit, carrying the weight of being a survivor when so many others had perished. "She blames herself," Sarah said softly, not moving her hand from the horse's neck. "She was the herd leader, and she feels responsible for not being able to protect them." McAllister's eyes widened. "How could you possibly know that?" Elena stepped forward, opening her bundle of healing materials. "My granddaughter speaks with the animal spirits, not just their bodies. This is why our healing methods work when modern medicine fails." Maria knelt beside Elena, studying the collection of herbs and roots with obvious fascination. "Could you teach me to prepare these? My mother showed me some traditional remedies, but nothing this extensive." "First, we must understand what we are treating," Elena said. She selected several items from her bundle and began arranging them in a specific pattern on the ground. "Sarah, what do the horses tell you about their sickness?" Sarah moved along the fence line, touching each horse briefly, allowing their experiences to flow through her. What she discovered made her stomach clench with worry. "It's not just a physical disease," she said finally. "There's something else. Something that attacked their spiritual connection to each other and to the land." She turned to face McAllister, her expression grave. "This isn't natural. Someone or something deliberately poisoned these animals, and they didn't just target their bodies. They targeted their spirits." McAllister's face went pale. "That's impossible. The veterinarians said it was some kind of virus or bacterial infection." "The veterinarians can only see what their instruments can measure," Elena said. "But poison that targets the spirit leaves different signs." Maria stood up slowly, brushing dirt from her knees. "There have been rumors," she said quietly. "Other ranchers have mentioned strange incidents. Gates left open, water sources contaminated, equipment sabotaged. Everyone assumed it was random vandalism, but what if it was something more organized?" Sarah felt a chill of understanding. Someone is deliberately targeting horse operations. But why? Elena's expression grew troubled. "There are those who believe that preserving the old ways of working with animals threatens their profits. If people learned that traditional methods could be more effective than expensive modern treatments, they'd lose money," McAllister finished. "Billions of dollars in veterinary medicines, specialized equipment, corporate breeding programs." Sarah looked back at Star Dancer, who was still standing close to the fence, as if seeking comfort from the human contact. "The horses know who did this. They remember. She closed her eyes and opened her mind fully to Star Dancer's memories. What she saw made her gasp and step backward. A man in expensive clothes, someone who looked like he belonged in corporate boardrooms rather than horse corrals. He had been feeding the horses treats that looked harmless but contained something that slowly destroyed their spiritual connections to each other. "I can see him," Sarah whispered. "Middle-aged, gray hair, expensive suit. He came to your ranch several times over the past few months, always bringing treats for the horses." McAllister's face went white as recognition dawned. "Thomas Hartley. He's a representative from Equine Industries International. They've been trying to buy my ranch for years, said they wanted to develop it into a commercial breeding facility." Maria's eyes flashed with anger. "And, when you refused to sell, they found another way to get what they wanted." "But, why would they target our reservation?" Sarah asked. "We're not a commercial operation." Elena's expression grew thoughtful. "Because we represent something they cannot control or profit from. If word spreads that traditional healing methods can cure diseases that modern medicine cannot, it threatens their entire business model." Sarah felt the weight of realization settling on her shoulders. This wasn't just about healing McAllister's horses anymore. This was about protecting an ancient way of life from people who saw tradition as an obstacle to profit. "We need to heal your horses," she told McAllister. "But, we also need to expose what really happened to them. If Equine Industries is behind this, they'll try again. They'll target other ranchers, other tribes, anyone who threatens their profits." McAllister nodded grimly. "I have connections in law enforcement, but we'll need proof." "Can your healing methods provide that?" Elena opened a different section of her bundle and withdrew several small vials filled with various powders and liquids. "Traditional healing doesn't just cure the body and spirit. It can also reveal the source of the poison." Over the next several hours, Sarah and Elena worked together to prepare a complex mixture of herbs, roots, and other natural ingredients. Maria assisted, learning the traditional preparation methods and asking thoughtful questions about the spiritual aspects of the healing process. As they worked, Sarah found herself growing more confident in her decision to trust McAllister and his daughter. Both of them showed genuine respect for the traditional methods, and neither tried to rush the process or demand immediate results. When the healing mixture was ready, Elena blessed it in the traditional way, calling on the spirits of the ancestors to guide their work. Then, Sarah approached Star Dancer again, this time carrying a small bowl of the prepared medicine. The mare accepted the treatment willingly, as if she understood that help had finally arrived. As the medicine took effect, Sarah could feel the spiritual poison beginning to leave Star Dancer's system. But, more importantly, she could see clear images of Thomas Hartley and his associates, their faces and voices becoming crystal clear in the horses' recovered memories. "I can see everything," Sarah said, her voice tight with concentration. "Hartley brought 3 other people with him. They had a plan to systematically destroy small ranch operations across the Southwest, starting with yours and eventually targeting our reservation." Maria was recording everything on her phone, documenting both the healing process and Sarah's revelations. "This could be evidence," she said. "If we can prove that Hartley and his company were responsible for the poisoning, we can stop them from doing it again." Over the course of the day, Sarah and Elena treated all 18 horses. With each animal they healed, the picture became clearer. Equine Industries International had developed a systematic plan to destroy independent horse operations and force owners to sell their land for commercial development. But they had underestimated the power of traditional healing methods and the spiritual connection between the horses and those who cared for them. As the sun began to set, the transformation in McAllister's horses was remarkable. They had regrouped into a natural herd formation, their social bonds restored along with their physical health. Star Dancer had resumed her role as the leader, and all 18 animals moved together with the fluid grace that marked healthy, spiritually connected horses. McAllister stood at the fence, tears in his eyes as he watched his horses behaving normally for the first time in weeks. "I don't know how to thank you," he said. "You've given me back more than just my horses. You've given me back hope." But Elena's expression remains serious. "The healing is only the beginning," James McAllister. Now we must decide what to do with the knowledge we have gained. Maria lowered her phone and looked at the group. I think I know someone who can help us. My mother's cousin works for the FBI's Environmental Crime Unit. If we can provide her with the evidence we've gathered today, she might be able to build a case against Equine Industries. Sarah felt Star Dancer's thoughts brush against her mind. The mare was trying to tell her something important. She approached the fence again and placed her hand on the horse's neck. Images flooded her consciousness. Hartley and his associates hadn't just targeted McAllister's ranch and planned to target the reservation. They had a list of over 50 small horse operations across the Southwest, all scheduled for systematic destruction over the next 2 years. There are others, Sarah said urgently. Dozens of ranchers and horse operations that are going to be targeted. We have to warn them. McAllister pulled out his phone. I know most of the independent ranchers in this region. If we can contact them tonight, we might be able to prevent Hartley from destroying any more herds. Elena gathered her healing materials, wrapping them carefully in their leather bundle. This is good work, she said. But, Sarah, you must understand that what we do next will change everything. Once we expose these people, there will be consequences. They will try to discredit our methods, our traditions, our very way of life. Sarah looked at the 18 healthy horses, then at McAllister and Maria, who were already making phone calls to warn other ranchers. She thought about her own community, the financial crisis they faced, and the choice between preserving tradition and embracing change. Sometimes preserving tradition means fighting for it, she said finally. Our ancestors didn't survive by hiding from challenges. They survived by meeting them head-on. As darkness fell over the desert, the group made their way back to the reservation. They had work to do, phone calls to make, evidence to gather, and a battle to fight against those who would destroy traditional ways of life for profit. But, as they drove through the night, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced in months: hope. Not just for her own community, but for all the people and animals who depended on the ancient wisdom that connected spirit to spirit, heart to heart, across species and generations. The real test was just beginning, but, for the first time since the financial crisis had threatened her people's way of life, Sarah believed they might actually win. 3 days after healing McAllister's horses, Sarah found herself sitting in a sterile conference room in downtown Phoenix, surrounded by FBI agents, veterinarians, and lawyers. The contrast between this cold, artificial environment and the warm, natural setting where she had performed the healing couldn't have been more stark. Agent Diana Whitehorse, Maria's cousin and a member of the Navajo Nation herself, sat across from Sarah with a thick folder of documents spread before her. Despite sharing Native heritage, Diana looked every inch the federal agent in her crisp suit and serious demeanor. Ms. Running Bear, Diana said formally, I need you to understand the seriousness of what you're alleging. Equine Industries International is a multi-billion-dollar corporation with operations across the United States. Accusing them of deliberate poisoning and corporate sabotage requires extraordinary evidence. Sarah glanced at Maria, who sat beside her father at the far end of the table. The young woman had spent the last 3 days documenting everything: the healing process, the horses' recovered memories, and the phone calls that had revealed the full scope of Equine Industries' planned attacks on independent ranchers. I understand the seriousness, Sarah replied calmly. But, I also understand what I saw in those horses' memories. Thomas Hartley and his associates systematically poisoned Mr. McAllister's herd with a substance designed to destroy their spiritual connections to each other and to their caretakers. Dr. Peterson, the chief veterinarian who had been called in to examine McAllister's horses, shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Ms. Running Bear, while I respect traditional healing methods, you have to understand that what you're describing, spiritual poisoning, memory retrieval from animals, these concepts have no basis in veterinary science. Elena, who had remained silent until now, leaned forward. Dr. Peterson, with respect, your science has failed these animals completely. You examined them for weeks and found nothing. In one day, using methods your instruments cannot measure, my granddaughter not only healed them but identified the source of their illness. McAllister cleared his throat. If I may, he said, I'd like to point out that regardless of how we obtained this information, the horses are now completely healthy. Every test you've run in the last 3 days confirms that. Whatever Sarah and Elena did, it worked. Agent Whitehorse consulted her notes. That's true. But, healing the animals doesn't prove that Equine Industries was responsible for making them sick in the first place. Maria stood up and walked to a laptop computer that had been set up at the end of the table. Actually, it might, she said. Over the last 3 days, I'd been in contact with 12 other ranchers who reported similar symptoms in their herds. All of them remember being visited by Thomas Hartley within the past 6 months. All of them were offered buyouts by Equine Industries. And all of them refused. She pulled up a map on the computer screen showing the locations of the affected ranches. Look at the pattern. Every single one of these operations is located on land that Equine Industries has been trying to acquire for their commercial breeding program. Dr. Peterson studied the map with growing concern. This does suggest a systematic approach, he admitted. But, we still need physical evidence. Blood tests, soil samples, something that proves deliberate contamination. Sarah felt a familiar stirring in her mind. Star Dancer, even though she was miles away at McAllister's temporary facility, was trying to communicate with her. The mare was showing her something important, something hidden. The evidence is there, Sarah said suddenly. Star Dancer is telling me where to find it. All eyes turned to her. Agent Whitehorse frowned. Ms. Running Bear, I need you to be very clear about what you're saying. Sarah closed her eyes and opened her mind to the connection with Star Dancer. Images flowed through her consciousness, Hartley and his associates burying something near the water source at McAllister's ranch, something they thought would never be discovered. There are containers buried near the main water trough at Mr. McAllister's ranch, she said. Small metal cylinders, about 6 inches long. Hartley's people buried them there after the horses started getting sick, probably to hide the evidence. McAllister sat up straight. I can take you there right now. If Sarah's right, we'll find your physical evidence. Agent Whitehorse looked skeptical, but she closed her folder and stood up. All right. Let's go take a look. 2 hours later, the entire group stood around an excavation site near the water source at McAllister's ranch. Using ground-penetrating radar equipment that the FBI had brought, they had located several buried objects exactly where Sarah had said they would be. Agent Whitehorse carefully lifted a small metal cylinder from the excavated hole. It was labeled with chemical symbols and bore the logo of Equine Industries International. Well, she said, her voice filled with amazement, this is definitely physical evidence. Dr. Peterson examined the cylinder and its contents. This appears to be some kind of slow-release chemical compound. If it was designed to leach into the water supply gradually, it could have poisoned the horses over several weeks without leaving obvious traces. Maria was documenting everything with her phone, but her expression was grim. This proves they did it, but it also means they have a reproducible method. They could be using this same technique at all the other ranches. Elena knelt beside the excavation site and scooped up a handful of the contaminated soil. The earth itself remembers the poison, she said softly. It will take time for the land to heal, even after the source is removed. Agent Whitehorse was already on her radio, calling for additional FBI teams to investigate the other affected ranches. We're going to need to move fast, she said. If Equine Industries realizes we're onto them, they might accelerate their timeline. As if in response to her words, McAllister's phone rang. He answered it, his expression growing increasingly concerned as he listened. That was Jack Morrison, a rancher about 50 miles south of here, he said after hanging up. His horses started showing symptoms yesterday. And Thomas Hartley was seen in the area 3 days ago. Sarah felt a surge of urgency. We have to get there immediately. If we can treat his horses before the spiritual damage becomes permanent, we might be able to save them. Dr. Peterson hesitated. Ms. Running Bear, I appreciate what you accomplished with Mr. McAllister's horses, but treating animals without proper veterinary oversight could be dangerous. Elena stood up, brushing soil from her hands. Dr. Peterson, my granddaughter has never harmed an animal in her life. But your proper veterinary oversight has failed to cure a single horse affected by this poison.
Agent Whitehorse made a quick decision. We're all going.
Dr. Peterson, you can observe and document everything.
Maria, keep recording. Sarah and Elena, you'll have my full support to do whatever you think is necessary.
The caravan of vehicles that arrived at Morrison's ranch an hour later looked like something between a medical emergency response and a FBI raid.
Morrison, a weathered man in his 60s, met them at the gate with obvious relief on his face.
I've lost 4 horses already, he said, leading them toward his pastures.
The others are getting worse by the hour. The local vet doesn't know what to do. As they approached the affected animals, Sarah could immediately sense the spiritual poison working its way through their systems.
These horses were earlier in the process than McAllister's had been, which meant the damage was less severe but also more urgent to treat.
We need to work quickly, she told Elena.
The poison is still spreading through their connections to each other. Elena was already preparing her healing materials, but this time she had help. Maria had learned enough over the past few days to assist with the basic preparations, and Dr. Peterson was documenting every step of the process with scientific precision. As Sarah began working with the first horse, a young stallion who was showing early symptoms of the spiritual disconnection, she became aware of something else. Agent Whitehorse was receiving phone calls every few minutes, each one bringing news of additional affected ranches. It's accelerating, the agent reported grimly. We've got reports of sick horses from 6 more operations, all in the last 24 hours.
McAllister looked up from helping Elena prepare healing medicines. They know we're onto them. They're trying to finish the job before we can stop them.
Sarah finished treating the stallion and moved to the next horse, a beautiful mare who reminded her of Star Dancer. As she worked, she could feel the mare's memories of Hartley's visit, confirming that he had used the same method here as at McAllister's ranch. But there was something else in the mare's memories, something that made Sarah's blood run cold. They're not just targeting individual ranches, she said urgently.
They're planning something bigger.
Something that would affect horses across the entire Southwest.
Elena paused in her preparations. What do you see, child?
Sarah kept her hands on the mare's neck, drawing out the buried memories.
There's a central facility, somewhere in Nevada. They're planning to contaminate a major feed supplier that delivers to hundreds of ranches.
If they succeed, thousands of horses could be affected simultaneously. Agent Whitehorse immediately got on her radio, contacting FBI offices in Nevada and requesting emergency surveillance of feed supply companies in the region. As the day wore on, the team worked tirelessly to heal Morrison's horses while coordinating with law enforcement agencies across multiple states. Sarah found herself at the center of it all, using her unique abilities to not only heal animals but to extract crucial intelligence about equine industry's broader plans.
By evening, Morrison's horses were showing significant improvement, their spiritual connections restored and their physical symptoms beginning to fade.
But Agent Whitehorse's phone calls had revealed the true scope of the crisis they were facing.
We've identified 17 affected ranches so far, she reported to the group.
And Sarah was right about the feed supply company. There's a facility in Nevada that supplies about 60% of the independent horse operations in the Southwest.
Intelligence suggests they're planning to introduce contaminated feed into the supply chain within the next few days.
Dr. Peterson, who had spent the day observing and documenting Sarah's healing methods, looked deeply troubled. If thousands of horses are affected simultaneously, we won't be able to treat them all using traditional methods. The scale would be impossible to manage.
Elena looked at her granddaughter with pride and concern.
Sarah has great gifts, but she is only one person. To heal thousands of horses, we would need many healers working together. Maria looked up from her documentation.
What if we could teach the methods to others? Veterinarians, ranchers, anyone willing to learn? Traditional healing cannot be learned overnight, Elena said gently. It requires years of training, a deep spiritual connection to the animals, and gifts that cannot be taught. But Sarah was thinking about something else. Grandmother, you said that gifts cannot be taught. But what if they could be awakened? What if the ability to connect with horses' spirits is something that exists in many people, but has been suppressed by modern thinking? Elena's eyes widened with understanding. You think we could awaken the old connections in others?
I think we have to try. If Equine Industries succeeds with their plan, it won't just be about saving horses anymore. It will be about preserving an entire way of life that connects humans and animals in harmony. Agent Whitehorse gathered the team around Morrison's kitchen table as the sun set over the desert. Maps, phone records, and chemical analysis reports were spread across the surface, creating a complex picture of corporate conspiracy and environmental terrorism.
Here's where we stand, she said. We have enough evidence to arrest Thomas Hartley and several of his associates. We can probably shut down their immediate operations and prevent the contamination of the feed supply. But Equine Industries itself is a massive corporation with operations in dozens of countries.
This is likely just one small part of a much larger plan. McAllister leaned back in his chair, exhaustion clear on his face. So we stop this immediate threat, but we don't solve the bigger problem.
Not necessarily, Sarah said. What if we create something they can't destroy or corrupt? What if we establish a network of traditional healers working with modern veterinarians, people who can't be bought or intimidated?
Elena smiled for the first time in days.
My granddaughter thinks like a warrior.
Maria looked up from her laptop, where she had been organizing all the documentation they had gathered.
I might have an idea about how to make that work. My veterinary program has connections with schools across the country.
If we could develop a curriculum that combines traditional healing methods with modern veterinary science, we could create a new generation of healers, Dr. Peterson finished, surprising everyone with his enthusiasm. People who understand both approaches and can use them together.
Agent Whitehorse nodded slowly. That's a long-term solution.
But first, we have to deal with the immediate crisis.
Sarah, how many horses do you think you could treat if we had to move fast?
Sarah thought about the exhaustion she felt after treating just a few animals, the emotional and spiritual drain of connecting so deeply with traumatized creatures. Maybe 20 or 30 in a day, if I pushed myself to the limit.
And if we had help? Other people with similar abilities?
Sarah looked at Elena, then at Maria and Dr. Peterson, both of whom had shown remarkable aptitude for learning the traditional methods. If we could awaken the gifts in even a few others, we might be able to handle 100 horses.
Maybe more.
Elena stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the desert landscape where their ancestors had ridden free for countless generations. There is a ceremony, she said quietly.
A way to awaken the connection between human and horse spirits.
It has not been performed in many years, but my grandmother taught it to me. Sarah felt her heart race with possibility and fear.
How many people could participate?
As many as are willing to open their hearts to the old ways. But, Sarah, you must understand, once this ceremony is performed, once these connections are awakened, there is no going back. Those who participate will be forever changed.
Agent Whitehorse checked her watch. How long would this ceremony take?
One night, Elena replied.
From sunset to sunrise. By dawn, we would know who among us carries the ancient gifts.
McAllister looked at his daughter, then at Sarah and Elena.
One night to awaken gifts that could save thousands of horses and preserve traditional ways of life that go back centuries.
When do we start? Elena smiled, and, for the first time in months, Sarah saw hope shining in her grandmother's eyes.
Tonight. We start tonight.
As the sun began to set over the Arizona desert, nearly 50 people gathered in a circle on the sacred grounds of the Apache reservation. Word had spread quickly through the network of horse lovers, ranchers, veterinarians, and tribal members about the ceremony that would determine who could awaken the ancient gift of communicating with horses. Sarah stood in the center of the circle, her heart pounding with the weight of responsibility. Around her were faces both familiar and strange, Elena and the other tribal elders, McAllister and Maria, Dr. Peterson and several of his colleagues, Agent Whitehorse and a team of FBI agents who had volunteered to participate, and dozens of ranchers from across the Southwest who had driven through the night to be here. The volunteers ranged from experienced horse trainers to complete newcomers who simply felt called to participate. Some were Native American, carrying fragments of their own tribal traditions. Others were descendants of European settlers whose families had worked with horses for generations. A few were urban professionals who had never lived on a ranch but felt a deep, inexplicable connection to the animals. Elena had spent the day preparing for the ceremony, gathering sacred materials and consulting with the other tribal elders about the proper protocols. This was not a decision made lightly. The ceremony had not been performed in over 70 years, and awakening spiritual gifts in so many people at once carried risks that none of them fully understood. Before we begin, Elena announced to the assembled group, "You must understand what you are asking for. This ceremony will open your hearts and minds to connections that most modern people have forgotten. You will feel what the horses feel, share their memories, experience their pain and joy as if it were your own. Some of you will find this gift to be a blessing. Others may find it overwhelming." A young woman named Katie, a veterinary student from Colorado, raised her hand nervously. "Is it dangerous? Could we be hurt by connecting too deeply with traumatized animals?" Sarah answered before Elena could respond. "The danger is not to your body, but to your spirit. When you open yourself to an animal's experiences, you open yourself to everything they have felt: fear, pain, loss, but also love, freedom, and joy. You have to be strong enough to carry their burdens without being crushed by them." Dr. Peterson, who had been quiet since arriving at the reservation, stepped forward. "I want everyone to know that I've spent the last week documenting Sarah's abilities using every scientific instrument at my disposal. What she does cannot be explained by current veterinary science, but it is undeniably real and effective. I'm participating tonight because I believe this knowledge could revolutionize how we care for animals." McAllister nodded agreement. 3 days ago, I was ready to put my surviving horses down rather than watch them suffer. Tonight, they're healthy and happy, living proof that these traditional methods work. I owe my horses' lives to Sarah and Elena, and I'm willing to do whatever it takes to make sure other animals receive the same care. As darkness fell, Elena began the ceremony by burning sage and sweetgrass, filling the desert air with sacred smoke. She spoke in the Apache language, calling on the spirits of ancestors who had worked with horses for countless generations. Then, she switched to English, so that everyone could understand the gravity of what they were attempting. "Tonight, we ask the spirits to awaken the connections that exist between all living beings," she said. "We ask to remember what our modern world has taught us to forget, that humans and animals are part of the same sacred web of life." Sarah felt the familiar stirring in her mind as her connection to the horses strengthened. Even though the reservation's herd was grazing several miles away, she could sense their presence, their awareness of the ceremony taking place. One by one, the participants stepped forward to receive Elena's blessing. Some showed immediate signs of awakening, their eyes widening with wonder as they suddenly sensed the presence of animals around them. Others remained unchanged, their minds apparently closed to the spiritual connections the ceremony was meant to open. Maria was among the first to show signs of the gift awakening. As Elena placed her hands on the young woman's forehead, Maria gasped and staggered backward. "I can feel them," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "All of them. Every horse within miles. They're calling to each other, sharing their fears about what's been happening to their kind." Dr. Peterson was next. The skeptical veterinarian approached the ceremony with obvious doubt, but, as Elena blessed him, his scientific rationality crumbled before an overwhelming flood of animal consciousness. "This is impossible," he muttered, but his voice was filled with awe rather than disbelief. "I can sense their thoughts, their emotions. It's like suddenly being able to hear a frequency that was always there but I was never able to perceive." Agent Whitehorse surprised everyone by showing a particularly strong connection. As the blessing took effect, she immediately turned toward the east, her face filled with urgency. "There are horses in trouble," she said. "Miles from here, toward Nevada. They're calling for help." Sarah reached out with her own abilities and confirmed what the agent was sensing. "The feed contamination has already started. There are horses getting sick right now." Elena's expression grew grim. "How many?" Sarah and the other newly awakened participants pooled their perceptions, creating a collective map of animal distress across the Southwest. What they discovered was worse than anyone had imagined. Hundreds, Maria said, her voice shaking.
Maybe thousands. The contamination is spreading faster than we thought. McAllister was already reaching for his phone.
I can have helicopters ready in 30 minutes. We can transport healing supplies and people to the affected areas.
But Elena shook her head. Physical transportation will not be enough.
If thousands of horses are affected simultaneously, we need a different approach. She turned to Sarah.
Child, you have been thinking about this problem in the old way, going to each animal individually, healing them one by one.
But tonight, we have awakened a network of connected minds.
What if we could heal them all at once? Sarah felt a chill of understanding.
A spiritual network. Instead of traveling physically to each location, we could reach out through the connections between all horses, healing the entire herd simultaneously.
Dr. Peterson looked skeptical despite his newfound abilities. Is that even possible? The distance alone. Distance means nothing to the spirit, Elena said simply. Our ancestors knew this.
They could communicate with animals across vast distances, call herds to safety during storms, heal injuries without ever touching the affected animal.
Katie, the veterinary student, stepped forward. How do we do it?
I can feel the connections, but I don't know how to use them for healing. Elena began arranging her healing materials in a complex pattern around the circle.
We create a ceremony of shared healing. Each person contributes their spiritual energy to a collective effort.
Instead of one healer treating one animal, 50 healers treat 1,000 animals simultaneously.
Over the next hour, Elena taught the newly awakened participants how to focus their abilities, how to channel healing energy through the network of spiritual connections that linked all horses.
Sarah found herself at the center of the effort, serving as a focal point through which the collective healing energy could flow.
As midnight approached, the ceremony reached its peak.
Sarah could sense horses across hundreds of miles, sick animals calling out in pain and confusion, healthy animals responding with comfort and support, and, gradually, the healing energy of 50 human minds working together to counteract the spiritual poison that equine industries had spread.
The experience was unlike anything Sarah had ever felt.
Instead of the exhausting individual effort required to heal one animal at a time, she felt supported and strengthened by the collective will of all the participants. Each person's unique gifts added something different to the healing effort: Maria's scientific understanding, Dr. Peterson's medical knowledge, Agent Whitehorse's determination to see justice done, Elena's deep wisdom, and McAllister's love for his animals. Through the network of connections, Sarah could see the healing taking effect across vast distances. Horses that had been stumbling with spiritual confusion began to stand straighter. Animals that had lost their herd bonds began to reconnect with their companions. The poison that had been designed to destroy the sacred relationship between humans and horses was being neutralized by the very connections it had tried to sever.
But the ceremony revealed something else as well.
As the healing energy flowed through the network, the participants began to see not just the horses that were suffering, but the humans responsible for that suffering. Thomas Hartley and his associates were at their Nevada facility, preparing to release even more contaminated feed into the supply chain. They were confident that their plan was succeeding, unaware that their victims were fighting back using methods their corporate minds couldn't understand. Agent Whitehorse, still connected to the healing network, was simultaneously coordinating with FBI teams across multiple states. Through her earpiece, Sarah could hear reports of arrests being made, facilities being raided, and contaminated feed being seized.
"We've got them," the agent reported to the circle.
"Hartley is in custody, along with 12 of his associates. The Nevada facility has been shut down, and we've intercepted trucks carrying contaminated feed to 6 different states."
But Elena's expression remained concerned. Stopping this immediate threat is important, but it is not enough. Equine industries will simply find new ways to attack traditional practices. We need a permanent solution. Sarah, still serving as the focal point for the healing network, had an idea. What if we don't just heal the horses? What if we create a permanent connection between all of us, a network that can detect and respond to future threats before they become crises? Maria looked up from documenting the ceremony.
Like an early warning system, but based on spiritual connections instead of technology.
Dr. Peterson nodded enthusiastically. We could integrate this network with modern veterinary practices.
Traditional healers working alongside trained veterinarians, each contributing their unique abilities.
McAllister was thinking practically.
I have the resources to fund research facilities, training programs, whatever infrastructure this network needs to operate effectively.
Elena smiled with deep satisfaction.
You are thinking like true healers now, not just treating symptoms, but preventing future illness. As dawn approached, the immediate healing crisis had been resolved. Across the Southwest, thousands of horses were recovering from the spiritual poison that had been designed to destroy their connections to humans and to each other. The network of newly awakened healers remained connected, creating an invisible web of protection and care that stretched across hundreds of miles. But, more importantly, the ceremony had created something unprecedented, a bridge between ancient wisdom and modern science, a collaboration between traditional healers and trained professionals, and a community of people dedicated to preserving the sacred relationships between humans and animals. As the sun rose over the desert, Sarah stood in the center of the circle, exhausted but filled with hope. Around her, 50 people who had arrived as strangers were departing as family, connected by shared experiences and common purpose. Elena approached her granddaughter and placed a gentle hand on her shoulder.
You have done well, child. Your ancestors would be proud.
Sarah looked out at the desert landscape where wild horses could be seen grazing peacefully in the distance, no longer threatened by corporate greed or spiritual poison.
This is just the beginning, isn't it, grandmother? Elena nodded.
The beginning of a new age, when the wisdom of the past serves the needs of the present. When traditional knowledge and modern science work together instead of in opposition.
McAllister joined them, his daughter at his side.
Sarah, Elena, I want to make good on my original promise. The $1 million I offered for healing my horses, I want to use that money to establish a permanent training center here on the reservation. A place where people can learn to combine traditional healing methods with modern veterinary science.
Maria was already planning.
We could create a curriculum that teaches both approaches. Veterinary students could learn traditional healing methods, while young tribal members could gain modern scientific knowledge.
It would preserve both traditions while creating something entirely new.
Agent Whitehorse finished her final phone call and rejoined the group. Equine Industries International is facing federal charges in 6 states. Their stock price has collapsed, and several other corporations are being investigated for similar practices.
I think we've sent a clear message that traditional ways of life are not as vulnerable as some people thought.
Dr. Peterson was documenting everything in his notebook, trying to capture the scientific implications of what they had accomplished. I'm going to spend the rest of my career studying what happened here tonight. This could revolutionize not just veterinary medicine, but our entire understanding of the relationship between humans and animals.
Katie, the veterinary student, approached Sarah with obvious reverence. Would you teach me? I want to learn everything I can about traditional healing methods.
I think this could change how we care for all animals, not just horses. Sarah looked around at the faces of people who had become healers overnight, who had awakened gifts they never knew they possessed, who had committed themselves to preserving ancient wisdom while embracing modern knowledge. We'll teach anyone who wants to learn, she said. This knowledge belongs to everyone who has the heart to use it for healing instead of harm. Elena began gathering her ceremonial materials, wrapping them carefully for the journey home. The horses know that they are safe now, she said. They carry the memory of this night, and they will share it with their children and their children's children.
The connection between our peoples will never be broken again.
As the group dispersed, returning to their ranches and veterinary practices and FBI offices, they carried with them more than just newfound abilities. They carried the responsibility of preserving and protecting the sacred relationships between humans and animals for future generations. Sarah remained in the circle long after the others had left, feeling the presence of horses across vast distances, sensing their contentment and their trust. The financial crisis that had threatened her community was solved. The immediate danger to horses across the Southwest had been eliminated. But, more importantly, they had created something that would last for generations, a network of healers dedicated to preserving the ancient wisdom that connected all living beings. As she finally made her way home, Sarah thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment. It had started with a storm and a stranger's desperate offer. It had continued through healing and revelation, through battles with corporate greed and spiritual awakening. But it had ended with hope, hope for her people, hope for the horses they loved, and hope for a future where traditional wisdom and modern knowledge could work together to heal the world. The sun was fully up now, painting the desert in shades of gold and red. In the distance, the horses grazed peacefully, their spirits connected not just to each other but to the growing network of human healers who had committed themselves to their protection and care. Sarah smiled as she walked, knowing that her great-great-grandfather, Running Thunder, would have approved of what they had accomplished. They had honored the past while embracing the future, preserving ancient traditions while creating new possibilities. The rancher's shocking offer had indeed left the Apache tribe speechless, but only for a moment. Then, they had found their voices, spoken their truth, and changed the world.